Hi, DrBiology here. This is a short video on Paper 1 revision for your GCSE biology or your combined science biology exams related to bioenergetics, which in a nutshell covers photosynthesis and respiration. So in this topic, it's split into two things. So the first thing is photosynthesis. So we're going to look at the rates of photosynthesis and what affects the rates of photosynthesis, such as light. We're going to be looking at some calculations you can do, so calculating the rates of photosynthesis. We're going to be very closely looking at the required practical and also then what the plants use glucose for. Then we go on to respiration, so we're looking at aerobic respiration, that means with oxygen, and then anaerobic respiration without oxygen, and looking at the effects in both plants and animals. We then look at the response to exercise, so what happens in your body related to exercise and what happens if there's insufficient oxygen. And then finally we go on to metabolism to look at the reactions in the cell or body and to understand the importance of metabolism in your biological systems. So you would have studied photosynthesis in probably your Key Stage 3 studies and earlier, and you should know that it produces glucose for plants, and it uses light, takes place within the chloroplast of a plant, which contains chlorophyll that absorbs light. Now, one of the key things that it does mention in the specification is that you need to know that photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction, meaning that heat is transferred from the environment during the process. So all this means is that for it to occur, heat is required, and obviously photosynthesis occurs when it's warm enough for enzyme reactions to occur. Now again, in the spec it mentions that you need to know the word equation. So there is the word equation: carbon dioxide plus water with light and also chlorophyll gives you glucose plus oxygen. If you're doing higher tier, I would definitely learn the chemical equation, particularly know what glucose, the chemical formulae for glucose is, because that's quite a popular question. You don't need to revise the fact that it's a balanced equation. You just need to know what the main chemical symbols are and the main molecules that are involved in photosynthesis. Just one last point about the endothermic reaction as well. Just remember that when energy is transferred from the environment, it's usually, in this case, it is light. So the energy from light being transferred to the chloroplasts, because that is where photosynthesis is occurring in the plant. Just a quick reminder about the required practical. So the required practical looks at the effect of light intensity on the rate of photosynthesis. And I've actually done a video on this, okay, so the video can be found on DrBiology, so please do have a look at that. It goes through the main method that you would use and also what you would do then with the results, and it talks about the different variables, the independent variable, the thing you change, the control variables, the things you keep the same, and the dependent variables, the things that you would measure. This next section is for higher tier only, okay, and it's looking at the inverse relationship between distance and light. So as it says here, says there is an inverse relationship between distance and light intensity. So as the distance increases, okay, light intensity will decrease, but we need to understand by how much. Okay, and this is related to the distance away from a light source increases because photons of light become spread over a wider area. This diagram shows this relationship really well. So it shows that the light energy twice the distance, so if we look at twice the distance here, okay, is spread over 4 times the area, whereas at the distance at 3 times the distance, okay, you can see that it's spread over 9 times the area, and so on. So this is what we mean by the light intensity being inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So the actual calculation is relatively simple, and in an exam question I have seen they show you this calculation. They may not show you all of the time, but I have seen it. So it's 1 divided by d squared, meaning the distance squared. So for instance, if the lamp is 10 centimeters away from the plant, okay, it's 1 divided by 10 squared, which will give you 0.01. Okay, so if the lamp was 15 centimeters away, so we would do the same thing, 1 divided by d squared, so 15 squared, okay, and that would give us 0.0044. Okay, so next we're going to look at the factors that affect the rates of photosynthesis, and we've already mentioned light. Also we're going to look at carbon dioxide and temperature. So when we look at light, okay, so let's have a look at this graph. Let's move those other graphs out of the way. Okay, you can see on the y-axis you've got the rate of photosynthesis, okay, there. Okay, and you've got light intensity there, so increasing light intensity that way. So initially, as light increases, you'll get an increase in photosynthesis, but as you notice, eventually you will reach a plateau or a level, okay? This is the fact that you will reach what we call a limiting factor. Now what this means is that with a limiting factor, that it is some other factor that has become short in supply. So it could be, for example, water, carbon dioxide, or temperature. With this next graph, it's looking at the effects of temperature. Now again, as you can see, photosynthesis is very low when there are low temperatures. You can see the rate of photosynthesis, but as the temperature increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. And you'll notice it reaches an optimum point, that's called an optimum point, and then, as you can see, an increase in temperature leads to a massive drop-off in the rate of photosynthesis. As you will know from the section in organisation, you should know that enzyme-controlled reactions are really important, and they're very important in photosynthesis. Now, at low temperatures, there's going to be a limit in the number of molecular collisions between the enzyme and the substrate. However, at higher temperatures, you should know that enzymes become denatured, and that explains why at high temperatures the rate of photosynthesis drops to 0. And this last graph just shows the effects of increasing carbon dioxide, and very much like with light, you get an increase and then you get a leveling off. That's due to a limiting factor. Sometimes in an exam they'll ask you about limiting factors and they'll give you some information in a graph. So if we look at this graph, it's related to light intensity and the rates of photosynthesis. Now the first thing is you can see that as light intensity increases, so does the rate of photosynthesis. Okay, so increasing it increases the rate of photosynthesis, as you can see. And then it tends to reach a level. Okay, so in this case we're reaching a limiting factor, and it says another factor, for example carbon dioxide, is limiting any further increase, so the rate becomes constant. So if we increase the carbon dioxide levels, then the rates of photosynthesis will further increase up to a specific higher point. Okay, and that's because you've got rid of that limiting factor. However, eventually another factor then will become limiting. This is quite important to understand. For example, if they give you a question about growing plants in greenhouses, that you need to look at all of the key things that the plants need, but also reducing those limiting factors. This graph is a very popular one as well in the exam. So as you can see on the right hand side, they've shown you the CO2, carbon dioxide, at different temperatures. Okay, and you can see the effects on the rates of photosynthesis. So it's showing the effect of temperature at 2 different carbon dioxide concentrations. So you need to kind of work out which is the kind of highest rate of photosynthesis and why. In the specification, it does mention that glucose is produced in photosynthesis, and you need to know what it is used for. So here's a really good list. So firstly, you've got used in respiration, so released as energy. It can be joined together to make starch for storage. It can be combined with nitrates from active transport coming into the roots to make proteins. It could be joined together to make cellulose cell walls. It's converted into fats for oils and seeds, and then lastly is converted into fructose. So you can see the many things that it can be used for. And it's just a simple case, I think, of revising some examples. Okay, so on to the second half of this topic, and it's related to respiration and metabolism. As it says here, respiration is the process of transferring energy from glucose, which occurs in every cell. And respiration is an exothermic reaction. So heat is being transferred to the environment. This energy supplies all the energy needed for living processes. 3 energy are identified in the specification, and that is the chemical reactions to build large molecules, for movement, and also for keeping warm. So aerobic respiration is respiration using oxygen. Okay, it happens all the time in plants and animals. Okay, this usually happens in the mitochondria, so it's releasing energy. Now, one of the key things that many students say is that it produces energy, but it does not. It's releasing energy. You cannot produce energy, but you can release it. Again, in terms of learning your equations, note that this is the opposite of photosynthesis. Okay, so glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide and water. And again, I would learn the equation. You don't need to learn the balanced equation, but you do need to know what the main aspects are. So again, glucose is in there. You need to know oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So anaerobic respiration happens when there's not enough oxygen available, and particularly in animals. It happens in muscles. Okay, so you'll know that feeling when you have done a lot of exercise and lactic acid builds up in your muscles. So for animals, it is just glucose, which gives lactic acid, and a small amount of energy. So the problem is the oxidation of glucose is incomplete in anaerobic respiration, so much less energy. So much less energy is transferred than anaerobic, so much less energy. Okay, in plants it's slightly different. Okay, so plants and yeast cells, so this is plants and yeast actually, which is a fungus, and you can see that glucose is converted into ethanol, which is a form of alcohol, plus carbon dioxide. In yeast, this is known as fermentation. Okay, and fermentation means it has economic importance because it's used in the manufacture of bread and also alcoholic drinks. There we go, alcoholic drinks. So during exercise, several responses occur because your body needs to ensure that, or your muscles need to ensure that it's getting a sufficient amount of oxygen and glucose to allow aerobic respiration to occur. So during exercise, when your muscular activity increases, several changes are taking place, and this is what this graph is showing us. So I'll just move the graph over a bit so we can see it. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, when you are resting and your anticipation of exercise, your heart rate, which is the red line, and the breathing rate is relatively low. You start to exercise and there's a sudden increase, first of all, in your heart rate. So your heart rate increases first, and the arteries are supplying blood to your muscles. They dilate and widen. So this increases the flow of oxygenated blood to your exercising muscles. So this will increase cellular respiration. And this also increases the rate of carbon dioxide being produced, and it needs to be removed from the muscles. So the next is, you can see that the breathing rate is starting to increase, and it's getting as high as the heart rates. And the reason being is that you need to breathe more deeply, so you need to bring more air into your lungs each time you breathe in, and the rate at which oxygen is brought into your body and picked up by your red blood cells is increased. Consequently, it also means that you can get rid of any excess carbon dioxide that has built up. So in this way, the heart rate and the breathing rate increase during exercise to supply the muscles with what they need and to remove the extra waste produced. However, if you keep on going with your exercise and you start to run out of stores of glucose, such as glycogen, okay, you cannot necessarily keep up with the demands of your cells, and then a second thing will occur. And that will be anaerobic respiration, because if your heart and breathing rates can't keep up with the muscles, the supply of oxygen to the muscles fast enough, then you're not going to get complete breakdown of glucose. And therefore you need to use anaerobic respiration, which takes place without oxygen. As it says there, it leads to what we call an oxygen debt, okay, which is the buildup of lactic acid converted from glucose within the muscles during exercise. So it has to be removed after exercise, otherwise it will cause harm to the muscles, and so you need to repay that oxygen debt by resting and breathing deeply, okay? And it says here the lactic acid can also enter the bloodstream and get sent to the liver, where it's converted back into glucose. At this stage, it's probably worthwhile looking at some exam questions on this. They tend to give you some information in graphical form and in data form, and they expect you to analyse and evaluate that particular data. So for my students, you need to go to the Key Stage 4 GCSE Hub, and there will be some questions there under the topic of bioenergetics. And finally, metabolism. So you need to look at metabolism. It's a term used that is the sum of all the reactions in a cell or the body. So you need to know about metabolism in both plants and animals, okay? And you need to know that these reactions can build up molecules and they can break them down. And these are all controlled by enzymes. Okay, so in plants, you've got a summary of the things that build up substances following photosynthesis. So we've already discussed those things. Okay, in other words, what glucose is used for, and that's a summary. And then in plants, where it breaks down things. So for example, starch can be broken down into glucose and lipids into glucose. Glucose can be used for respiration, and also proteins, the breakdown of proteins into amino acids, and they're removed to produce glucose. Okay, and finally in animals, a summary of the reactions following the absorption of the products of digestion. So you would have done about that in organisation. and then summary of the reactions that break down the compounds. Okay, so you can see that glucose respiration occurs. Also, amino groups are removed, so urea is released. And again, you probably learn a bit more about that in paper 2, homeostasis and response. Hope you found this whistle-stop tour useful. I will be going through some of these topics in a bit more detail. I particularly intend to go through some exam technique with this section of work at a later date. So if you found it useful, please do subscribe to DrBiology, and there's going to be a lot more videos coming shortly.